Okay, what about this urbanization game? Let's see what we can say about it. First of all, the reaction over on BGG is underwhelming. It's got, what looks like a fairly decent rating, honestly, but no one loves it. I mean, there's people who give it a 10, but the highest number of playings this game has recorded there is 7. That means that people who really, really love it must be game flitters, kind of like me, right? Who play a game a couple of times and say, yeah, that's enough for now, maybe in a few years, or maybe I'll sell it now, or whatever. That's probably more telling than anything I can give you in the review, is the simple fact that no one's playing this, and it didn't seem to get a huge influx of love right away either. Given that, you kind of wonder about the rating, given, BGG's criteria for rating a game is based on, at least in part, this is part of the problem, is that they kind of like make it sound like you're rating the game both on how good the game is and how willing you are to play it. And the two don't match. So it'll say, this is a terrific game, I'd play it any time. Well, no, obviously, no matter how good Campaign North Africa is, I'm not able to play it any time, right? On the other hand, I quite often want to play, am willing to play some really bad games that I do not have much respect for. I might even enjoy them, but that's a third issue here. I'm willing to say good game and enjoyment maybe should go together better, but good game and willing to play, maybe not. Anyway, given that guidance and that most Eurogamers seem to kind of follow it largely, it seems very strange that this has, above a 6 rating if the most plays that anybody's given it is 7. I mean, whatever. Anyway. Let's go on and take a look at this. Let's look at the components first, which are pretty good. I like the money. It's this hard stock stuff, a lot better than paper money. It's not going to blow around in the wind. It's got some sturdiness to it. But it still fits sort of that nice size for money. There's an expense to making something like this. Obviously, you got your colored cubes. Hey, great. I'm never big on circular things. Here we have cylinders. They tend to fly around a little too much. You get all these wonderful looking little buildings. Little problem here is that the factories and the apartment buildings or whatever look similar in shape. The government buildings have kind of this one weird oddity little thing jutting out. This actually looks more like one of the buildings I used to live in. And closest to a high-rise, it was only 5 stories, I think. Anyway, that can cause some problems when you're sorting the pieces. One might get mixed with the others, but no really big deal. Very power gridish tiles for the different factories, and they serve a kind of similar use in this game, actually. Maybe you have your cards, they're fine. You don't have to shuffle anything in this game. There's no luck whatsoever in it. So, the cards are just like tiles or anything else. They're serving a simple purpose. One problem is the cards don't always have all the information you need to play the game in them, and neither do the rules. The rules just reproduce what's on the cards, and they leave you with some ambiguities. That's a big problem because this is, well, we'll get to the key point here later, but this is a Euro with very little real connection to what the hell is going on. I bought it thinking, it's going to be closer to like representing the growth of a town than urban sprawl. I don't know where I got that idea from. Certainly not the comments, but that's where I thought I did. Sometimes I think maybe I start watching a game and think it's cool, and maybe I have it mixed up with something else. So maybe there's something else that I thought this was. I know I got into that with not New England Railways, Railways of New England or something like that. There's a couple of those. I bought that recently and realized, gee, if I had looked a little more carefully at the comments, I think I wouldn't have been as interested in this as I thought. Maybe someone in that case gave me oh yeah, it's kind of like Silverton Light or something, and I was like, oh, that sounds cool, without looking too hard at what's going on. Player aid cards. The writing on these is too tiny for the additional information there for somebody whose eyes are going bad, but if you got reasonable eyes, you can probably read these fine. The board, when you're playing, it gets cluttered, but it doesn't serve too much of a purpose for the board itself. These different areas are, clear and represented. The hard part is over here, but it doesn't really make too much difference. I think there's a really cute thing with the board reduction tiles, and I especially get a kick out of these match the appearance on the actual board tiles. That reminds me of it was something like Prize Property or something like that. It was a game where you got to develop property, and you I think you pulled off undeveloped land, and it turned into stuff that you could develop, and you put a marina down and this, that, and the other. I thought it was, this awesome idea for a game, back when I was like 8 or whatever. But I never got to play it, and then I didn't get it until I was much older, and it wasn't anywhere near as cool as I had hoped it would be. Which is to say, it's far worse than Monopoly as a game. But it's got this hammer where you shake up the marbles. Really, really kind of cool little pieces to go with. The rule book is a piece of shit. Any game that starts off like this, with a picture and trying to describe stuff that way, is not good. It does try to follow everything here in terms of, hey, giving you everything that's going on. It doesn't really give you much feel at all for what the hell you're trying to do in the game, and that's a common problem in Euros, is this attitude that, well, what you're trying to do, that's the whole game, that's what you're trying to figure out, that's why you're playing, right? Yeah, maybe if you want to play it twice, I mean, which this manages to meet those expectations, right? And it's also not giving any kind of real feeling for why certain choices were made. So, for example, in this game, the economic model revolving around the grain makes no sense whatsoever. There's no explanation or reason to understand the economic model relating to the factories and work orders and how they work. And I mean, it's just not intuitive at all. The grain is counterintuitive. The only thing in the game that makes any sense to me at all, and it's got its little twists, but you can write them off as, okay, but there was a cool idea here, has to do with the price of property. As more property is purchased, the prices go up, and it's kind of cool because everything's the same price to begin with, but you shift the little tokens around to places that you think look valuable to someone else. That's a really cool little mechanism. But the rest in here seems kind of crazy. Okay. And on top of that, there's ambiguities in the rules. And then finally, there's sort of a couple of pages at the back. Well, no, there isn't really. What really needs to be done is a bigger player aid than what the players are given. Like a sheet or two of paper that gives, a quick summation of everything that happens step by step. But that's actually kind of what the rules are. It's just they bloat a little bit too much and aren't always completely nailing things down. I think the rule book actually nails things down more than the little roll cards. And likewise, there may be some ambiguities over here in the tech innovations. This whole thing is, and this is goofy, this is the Kickstarter bonus, but it came with every game as far as I can tell. And you kind of don't have a complete game if you don't have this. For one thing, it includes a player aid with all the roll cards on it. For another, the game's pretty light, and you probably don't want to play it too many times without the inventions. The inventions, though, throw a layer of complexity where there's way too many little things that are all just different, and you have to memorize them all and their effects. And they also don't mesh quite as well in terms of the rest of the game kind of, well, no. The board, the land areas of the game, kind of and the factories kind of follow this, hey, we're going to make this so that it plays presumably equally well in 2, 3, or 4 players. Well, the truth of the matter is, no, I don't think it does play equally well in each. Or it doesn't play the same. There's some significant differences, which I'm not sure that, cutting the land size makes that big a difference in the number of factories. But by cutting the land size and the number of factories, you get the number of factories. It's important to cut because you get a certain pace to the game. The game is going to end just about as the factories are running out. So you get a nice mix of factories because they're kind of time based. So like the early ones, there's more orange. The late ones, there is no orange, and there are white factories. And with the land, well, there's an element to the game that's competition for land, for territory. So if you don't, if you were playing only in 2 with the full board, you wouldn't have that anymore. It would just be too easy to expand. So those 2 elements are particularly important, but one thing that doesn't fit so well is that, again, all of the technologies show up, they don't get trimmed, and some of those technologies relate, and part of their value is based on factories that don't exist, So there you have that. What about the actual play of the game? Let me look through the sequence of play. So first there's this role selection, which it's not quite the role selection of Puerto Rico, San Juan, Twilight Imperium. It's one where you get to do something and that's it. It's an okay mechanism, I see no problem with throwing that in there, and it doesn't create any huge issues based on the subject matter. It makes sense that you can hire somebody who gives you a bonus on something. You don't have to pay anything for the hire, it's just you just get one. The next thing is the different actions. Purchasing land, like I said, there's a cool competition going on with that. Erecting buildings, there's something weird here, and there's something weird about this whole game, which is there's this competition that I'm not used to seeing in a game for resources, where, like the number of buildings is a limited resource, kind of like in Monopoly, only it's harsher here. The number of cubes that are available for grain, but more, that's actually numerically limited by that's limited by the number of players. But for the work orders, changes the tenor of the game between 2 to 4 players. In 2 players, there was never too much competition for, oh yeah, we're almost out of orange cubes. I think that competition is an interesting factor in the game, and I think it's funny that you don't reduce those numbers. I would suggest modding the game so in 2 or 3 players you would actually only have a proportion of the cubes out there. It's kind of cool that you can farm. It's not a way to victory, but sometimes it might be a piece that can help you more than any other little thing that you can do. Receiving work orders. This is the weirdest thing in the world. So in order to build factories, you spend one of your actions to go take cubes of that factory's color, largely. And once they're all filled out and one last thing is placed, then somebody can build that factory. Those cubes that you take are then what you pump back into that factory to create product. And creating product gives you money, and this is also linked together. Creating product gives you money and victory points, but it uses up something that your population needs. Okay, kind of like food and housing, your population also needs potential work available. They don't actually have to be working. You never have to actually produce anything. And this is where the model for the game completely falls apart. I mean, this just doesn't make any sense at all. Neither does the selling grain, but we'll get I think, yeah, we haven't hit that. We ran over that without thinking about it too much. So selling grain's a problem because, yes, as you buy grain, it gets progressively more expensive as it becomes rare. And there's a mechanism in place that makes it more expensive if you want to buy a lot of grain at once. Of course, that's kind of the opposite. Like, hey, if I want a lot at once, I should get it cheaper, right? Okay, but then there's when you sell grain back, you're never going to make money off of it unless you have some weird technology. Because when you sell it back, no matter the rarer, the more scarce grain is, the more guaranteed you are to get a low price for it. It's only when you sell a lot of grain in a scarce market that you actually get a good price. And it's just, the economics here just don't make sense. So this stops being a game about something, and it starts becoming this really weird mathematical exercise. Now, it's an interesting mathematical exercise, though, in some ways. So I'm not really terribly opposed to that. And it's kind of neat to try to figure out what what kind of world this is that you're talking about as well. Likewise with the industry thing. Again, it's this weird little mathematical game you're playing, and the whole game is, the basis of all of these ends up being this weird balancing act, where you've got to keep your cubes, your housing, your grain, your technology, your land, your available land, all this stuff has to be kind of kept in this weird balance. Otherwise, the engine kind of goes off the rails a little bit, and you end up not doing as well as you might. And I find it kind of hard to tune that little engine. I know some people have said this is a really, really easy light Euro. I don't feel like that's the case. I feel like there's much more going on here than people are giving it credit for. And I find that maybe the problem, maybe the problem is people don't like trying to look at that kind of thing. I'm not sure. And, okay. You have, then you have this produced goods option, which, again, it doesn't really suit anything. It doesn't really map to anything in the real world. So you're taking these work orders you used to have, that you got when you built the building, which presumably would be for materials for the building or something, and they should have been fulfilled when the building got built, and you shift them over to an actual factory, and they give you money and victory points. But then the cubes go away, and these cubes are important to maintaining your population. Your population is going to be a sum of, or it's going to be the least of, and this reminds me of a Knizia game in terms of the way you have to keep this balance between these things. Your housing, your food, and the amount of work that you've promised to give sometime in the future. Thematically, none of it makes sense, but there is a really cool little mathematical exercise behind that. Finally, you have the opportunity to collect taxes, which gives you an amount of money equal to your workers. Now, you only get to do one of these in each of your pulses, and you get 4 pulses throughout each turn. Your roll will affect one of these things, and you're just sitting here with this kind of really tough balancing act. There are some problems, though, with the gameplay. Or maybe things that are disturbing. One of the things that's disturbing is when you're working to get a factory online. There's no way that you can do anything. Like, there's no real reason that you want someone else to have a factory. And the final position, at least that I know of, sometimes maybe to speed another one out that you might want. But in general, you're not helping each other in any way producing factories. Early on, as you slap additional cylinders onto a factory card, what you're going to be doing is you're filling these spaces. Well, the first one and the second one, whatever, they give you some cubes, work orders. Those are good resources. You want those. So people do that. This last one's money, and it's almost useless. Every now and then, it's worth taking an action to put a money on here. It may be the best thing you can do because you need a money. But usually there's a way to raise money that doesn't involve opening this up. And when you place this here, the next player has the option to just take this factory, which is worth 2 victory points and is clearly better than the money. So it's very unlikely, I think, that money space, that factories will ever be created through anything other than the special role. These things don't quite fit in the damn insert. It's very, very unlikely that any factories get produced by anything other than the industrialist boss, whatever, who just allows you to cash him in and take a factory without any effort. Every now and then it happens. Somebody wants to get a particular factory into play so that they can start working on it and get better cubes or something like that. And it's worth offering a factory up to someone, especially if the someone you're offering it up to isn't really in a great position and they can gain some bonus. Then you come to this administrative stage where this is where the technological cards become really, really difficult, because a lot of them take place in this administrative phase, and it's really hard to remember, oh yeah, I'm supposed to get an orange cube now, oh, I have an option to do this, oh, this happens, I get some victory points for it. You have to be aware of every single one of those cards that you have, and you kind of have to be aware of all the ones you don't have that you might get in other ones in other players' hands, just because of how you can, in terms of other people, how you can hurt them. But in terms of yourself, what you can gain off of these. Just making sure I'm recording. Yeah, it would suck if I wasn't. Okay. Also that my battery's still on. Then some time passes. This is a power grid type action. The lowest numbered factory, I guess, that nobody has. The rules are not, explicit about this. It could just be one that somebody has. Gets removed from the game. Cubes go back into the pool so that they're available again. The number of cubes available to start taking by working on the factories, by I don't know what it's even called. Receive work orders is what it's called, but you're actually progressing the factory. Those number of cubes is a limitation in the game, and it's this really weird one, It's our factories can't possibly be created because there's no way that people would want more gray material. And they won't work on the factory unless they're being given gray material, or some promises of gray material in the future. Again, there's just nothing here but the mathematical game. So forget about any kind of economic model here that makes any sense. Okay, now you make your count of how many citizens you have, and what's really cool about the citizens is they give you victory points each. And likewise, grain, if you have excess grain, you get victory points off of it. You don't have to sell it or anything like that. You're never going to make money off grain, except under some very strange circumstances that you can engineer. But you do actually make victory points, which is just kind of oh, cool. I didn't expect that the first time. That kind of won me the game the first time I played. And then you do some mechanical stuff to reset the board in terms of the grain, etc. Then the big catch-up mechanism happens. Whoever's in last place gets to be the mayor. That means they get first roll selection, first play on all 4 of the little phases in the next turn. And they also get a bonus victory point for no good reason. So between these, they really keep the game kind of tight in a 2-player game. What I saw, though, was this kind of game turn ordering didn't work worth shit in a 4-player game. Because it's possible for the person in last place, and you might want to be in last place to constantly get a free victory point, right? As well as the bonuses, so you can build up your engine really nicely if you're if you have the mayor card. Anyway, what I saw was the person in first place going second far too many times, which means they get almost all of the advantages that are the catch-up mechanism. And in fact, it might become a piece of your strategy to try to work to keep the person to your, normally it would be to your right, in last place. that becomes a kind of weird sort of strategic plan. I didn't really investigate that in my own play. Again, there are a lot of things about this game that I don't think I've seen anywhere else. In a lot of ways, it's just, let's throw together a mishmash of a lot of kind of cool little mechanisms that people like the role selection, the power grid, kind of buying resources, but they don't work at all the way power grid does. It's funny because some people are harsh on people who, like me, who say, power grid feels like an economic model that makes sense. And then they come back with, but the power industry doesn't work that way. And the question is, well, is it better to have something that doesn't completely align? Or is it better to have something that completely doesn't align? So, for example, in my areas of interest, I get really pissed off at things like, Martin Wallace's Struggle of Empires or whatever, which... kind of looks like obviously is trying to purport to be around the 7 Years' War era. Probably the whole Austrian succession onward. In terms of the political situation that's represented and the board situation. But then the game just does not match that very well at all, especially in terms of starting positions. Okay, fair enough, but it gives you some flavor of it. It's kind of like Risk gives you some flavor of conquest and something. It makes some intuitive sense, but it doesn't map to anything particularly well. This is a Struggle of Nations or of Empires is a step further along that. And in some ways, the more specific they get and the more they fail, the worse it is. So like Soldier King kind of really bugs me because even with all the historical options, it still has some really wacky shit going on in it. So I can understand the point of the people who don't like Power Grid because it doesn't represent what's really going on. On the other hand, power industry economics is not something I know enough about to be bothered by it. Now, part of my being bothered with something like Struggle of Empires is, and especially Soldier King, is that it's giving people an idea that things were totally different than they actually are. And it's giving people a really false impression about this subject that I care about. And so I do understand why people are saying, hey, don't say this represents. Okay. I'll grant you, I don't know enough to make that judgment on Power Grid that it represents the power industry. I can tell you that a very naive view of economics says this makes intuitive sense. And there's something kind of nice about that, even if I'd be very disappointed to find out anything that really convinced me that it was false. I would probably dislike the game a lot more for that. And I actually kind of like the game because it does make intuitive sense. This one doesn't. And that's really disturbing. So there's a few things really working against this. First of all, the rules are a goddamn mess. And when you have that, right away, I bet 80% of the people who try to play this say, too much of a headache to figure out what's going on. We have to house rule what different cards may mean, or go online and look up all this, and maybe there exists a better rule book somewhere. But this was not a complete, and this was not a finished product when it was put out. The rule book is a failure. The rule book and the cards, etc., are a failure in terms of the information they convey. However, a couple of things going here. First of all, usually I don't like point salad type games, and this feels like one. I got all these different things that feed me victory points, and they happen at random weird times, and I'm just tracking them. Somehow it's not bothering me here. Somehow there's, and like I said, I hear people say this is simple. Maybe, I haven't played Kanban, and, I don't like, but I have played things like Le Havre. I have played Dominant Species, which I don't feel is all that complex. I feel like it's a lot of counting. I feel like the complexity of this is actually beyond my ability to desire to try to unwind. And that leads to what's almost a lighter style of play that's seat of the pants and intuitive, but I don't think that's all there's there. It's kind of Go-like in terms of there's an emergent complexity. So I'm actually beginning to get more impressed with this in theory. Which is to say, I'm not going to raise my rating. I've got a 6 on this, but I could see where this could make me play a few more times to try to see the patterns, because the patterns come out in that Go-like emergent quality. You can't brain burn your way through a game of Go, right? You just can't. It's horrible. You've got to do it from this kind of relaxed, external, seeing the patterns and learning to see the patterns. And I feel like that's the case in this game. And I think it's kind of weird that nobody's playing it, actually. If I'm not saying I can't see enough of this like I could in, say, Tigris and Euphrates to say, wow, this is really cool. But I have a suspicion that there is. And I'd suggest people giving it another shot if they've got it kicking on their shelves. Give it a shot or two, see what it has. Anyway, for me, there is this sort of, I get why people say it's light, because to me the complexity is enough, like in a war game, that I just seal it off and say, okay, I'm going to play more by the seat of my pants than anything else. And it seems to kind of work. What isn't good about this is that I don't think it scales perfect. I don't think it scales equally among the different number of players. I think you get the most competitive purely game in 2 players, but there's some weird things that you may want to do, like shoving the guy to your right down to make sure that you get second pick. And going after the person who's in the worst place on the board to knock them down, in order to give yourself an edge. And if the scores are kind of close, being in last place isn't bad at all. You want that. It's kind of the optimal thing you can do. Anyway, lots of interesting, weird kind of reverse decision making here. Balances that are just a little off what you expect them to be. And I think that's the whole thing, is by taking a mathematical model that has nothing to do with reality and presenting it, it just kind of gives you this, what the hell is going on in this game kind of feeling. And I don't know. I kind of like it from what I see. After my second playing with my wife, I felt like I had kind of learned all I cared to about it. But now playing it solo, I'm seeing a lot more to this than I thought I would. And yeah, maybe I will raise my rating. All right, let's go up.